metabolic processes, the pathway of different metabolic processes. Okay, so by definition, the metabolism, okay, it is defined, okay, in which involves the process in which the energy in food, okay, the energy in food, that is carbohydrates, proteins and lipids, okay, is converted into a usable form. That means in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so this metabolism is defined as a process which involves the conversion of food that is present in the energy into ATP that is used by our cell for day-to-day biological activities. For day-to-day biological activities. Okay? Right? There are different types of metabolism. Okay? And those types it involves. One is the catabolism. Okay? The catabolism process or the catabolic process is a degradation process. It is a degradation process. Okay? Next is the anabolism. Okay? This anabolism is a synthesis process. It is a synthesis process. And the third one is the amphibolism. Third one is the amphibolism, which involves both the catabolism and anabolism. Okay? The example for this catabolism, it is glycogenolysis. It is glycogenolysis. Okay? And the example for the anabolic processes, it is the glycogenesis. The glycogenesis. And the amphibolic pathway is the TCA cycle, also called as the tricarboxylic acid cycle, Krebs cycle, okay, citric acid cycle. It is an amphibolic pathways. Okay, and all this metabolic process, all these types of metabolism, that is catabolism, anabolism or amphibolism, they are highly regulated. They are highly regulated. Okay, and in our body, the metabolic processes, they are regulated either allosterically, okay, or hormonally. Okay, so these are the two different ways in which the metabolic pathways, they are regulated, and which of the pathways should be switched on and switched off, it depends upon the energy currency of the cell. Energy currency of the cell. So as I told you, this metabolism, it is a process in which the food, in the energy in the food, that is carbohydrate, proteins or liquids, it is converted into a usable form, and that usable form is the ATP. So any pathway that needs to switch on or switch off, it depends upon the energy currency of the cell, and for us the energy currency is the ATP, which is derived from the nutrients that we consume. Okay, now I will show you the metabolic pathways that happens in our body in an integrated manner. Okay, so I'll first start with glycogen. So this is the glycogen. It is a homopolysaccharide. Okay, it is a homopolysaccharide. Okay, and it is formed from the repeating units of glucose molecule. Okay, this glycogen, the glycogen is formed from the glucose. Okay, and during the fasting state, when the ATP concentration inside the cell decreases, this glycogen, it is degraded by the help of glycogen, this enzyme, glycogen phosphorylase, glycogen phosphorylase enzyme. Okay, and from the glycogen, this glucose 1 phosphate, it is yielded. Okay, this happens during the glycogenolysis process. Okay, and it is favored in fasting condition. It is favored in fasting condition. Okay, and when there is a low amount of blood glucose, okay, so there is a activation of the hormone, or there is a secretion of the hormone called as glucagon, which favor this process, that is glycogenolysis. Okay, and this happens during the fasting state. But in the well-fed state, this glucose 1 phosphate is converted into UDP glucose by the enzyme UDP glucose pyrophosphorylase. Okay, and this UDP glucose is the immediate source of glucose for formation of glycogen during glycogenesis, and the enzyme for glycogenesis is the glycogen synthase enzyme, okay, which is activated by the hormone called as insulin. Okay, so this insulin, it favors glycogenolysis, so we call it as a glucose mobilizing hormone. Okay, and this insulin, it favors the uptake of glucose inside the cell, and it is a glucose depositing hormones, and both have the contrast functions, and both of their secretion, it depends upon the concentration of ATP or ADP inside the cells. Okay, this glucose 1 phosphate that is derived from the glycogen is converted into glucose 6 phosphate, and the enzyme catalyzing this reaction is the phosphoglucomutase enzyme that interchanges the position of the phosphate group from one carbon to the 6th carbon. Hence, the glucose 6 phosphate can be formed. Okay. Now, the glucose 6 phosphate become a source for pentose phosphate pathway. Now, this pathway is very much important because it provides ribose sugar for the purine synthesis, and also the pentose phosphate pathway, it is required for the production of the compound which is NADPH. Okay, this NADPH is a very important coenzyme for multiple enzymes in our body. Okay, so the function of this NADPH is it helps in the antioxidant defense system, it helps in the respiratory burst. So respiratory burst is a phenomena that is shown by the neutrophils during the inflammation. Okay, and the pathway, the respiratory burst, it yields free radicals in the form of this hypochlorite ion that is involved in the elimination of the bacteria through damaging their cell membrane. Okay, so it is a very, very important compound, and this NADPH is also important for the antioxidant defense system in our body, where this is utilized by the enzyme glutathione reductase for the regeneration of the reduced glutathione, which serve as a coenzyme for the enzyme glutathione peroxidase. Okay, now this glucose 6 phosphate, okay, it can be converted into a free glucose by the enzyme glucose 6 phosphatase. Okay, this glucose 6 phosphatase enzyme, it is also an enzyme of glycogenolysis in liver, and it is also an enzyme of the gluconeogenesis. Okay, and this enzyme, which is glucose 6 phosphatase, it is not expressed by the muscle cells. Okay, so this glucose 6 phosphate can be converted into a glucose by the enzyme glucose 6 phosphatase. Okay, and this glucose and again can be phosphorylated at the 6th position by the enzyme called as hexokinase or glucokinase. kinase. Okay, so the above the pathway that is or the reaction that is catalyzed by the glucose 6 phosphatase, okay, is a part of glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Okay, the both of the pathway it is favored by the glucagon, whereas the glucose when it is phosphorylated by hexokinase or glucokinase it becomes a pathway of glycolysis which is favored by the insulin. Okay, and the rest of the pathway I'll be talking in the next video. Thank you.